All right. Okay, so this is the first week of the Love Story series. So romantic, so romantic. And I have a really romantic story to start with tonight. So romantic. Judges 16, the story of Samson and Delilah. That's romance, right? That's actually soap opera, I think. So it's really not a story of love. It's more a story of lies and loss. It's not really genuine love and romance. What it is greed and lust and manipulation and destruction, just like a modern-day soap opera. That's what we're looking at tonight, folks. This was the first one in history, I think. So what I'm going to do, first off, is I'm going to start by giving you the Cliff Note version here of the story, for those of you who don't know it. Rather than reading the entire, bogging us down with Scripture, we're going to look at the Cliff Notes really quick. Samson was a judge of the ancient Israelites, okay? Now, does anyone know what a judge was? Anyone have any idea? Or someone's hand, go ahead.
Like a person involved in the book of Judges sent to, basically, Israel get taken over, then they were supposed to take it back.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Someone knew that. I'm glad. Israel was always getting taken over by another country or another power because they would stop listening to God. So God would send this leader who would rise up and lead them. And this person would be what we call a judge. Kind of like anyone familiar with the Terminator series? That John Connor, okay, comes and leads his people to victory, okay? So Samson is one of those judges, okay? He's a Nazarite by birth. They had to take these special vows. Nazarites were consecrated or set aside for God, so they had to abstain from anything from the vine. So wine, alcohol, vinegar, grapes, I don't know why, but they had to. And they were also never supposed to cut their hair. So in the story, Samson has really long hair. This long hair was kind of a visual sign that you were set apart from God. People would see that and be like, oh, Nazarite, set apart for God. Kind of like Chris, long hair, set apart for God. That was what it was. So he was a Nazarite by birth. He was consecrated. He was set aside by God. And he has this crazy supernatural strength that God has given to him. You hear stories in the Bible of him fighting off armies with jawbones and ripping bears apart and stuff like that. So he's got this super crazy strength that God has given him. That's the superpower that he is going to use to help his people, because he's got to have some sort of advantage. But as a young adult, Samson decides that he wants to leave his homeland, sort of sow his wild oats, and he wants to kind of check out some other land, specifically the land of the Philistines, who at that time were like arch enemies of the Israelites. They were the people who were kind of trying to overthrow Israel. So he goes to the very land that everyone in his own home country really kind of despises, to kind of sow these wild oats, I guess. He ends up marrying one Philistine woman first. Strangely enough, he ends up, a couple days later giving the wife away to someone who attended the wedding. He gets in a big fight with a bunch of wedding guests and gives the wife away. So that was wife number one. Then he hooks up with a prostitute while he's in, another Philistine prostitute. So we're kind of getting a history of Samson and what he's like, sort of. Not quite a guy you want to bring home to mom. And then he finally meets Delilah, who is another Philistine woman. And just so we're clear on what it would have been like for these Philistines, it's kind of picture President Obama today kind of having a relationship with a high-ranking member of Al-Qaeda, or President Kennedy back in the Cold War era having a relationship with a Russian spy. Not a good idea for you personally. You put yourself in danger. But Samson is really also putting everyone in his country in danger. So understand that this was a bad decision that Samson is making from the get-go by the people he decides to go after. But what I want to look at now is, why was Samson such an easy target for Delilah? Because Delilah is a Philistine, and the Philistine rulers decide that because Samson has now fallen for another Philistine woman, they're going to use her to find out what the key is to Samson's strength so we can imprison him and finally overthrow Israel, is basically what's going on. They're plotting against him. And they choose a very, very good person to do that in Delilah. And Samson was an easy target, right? I don't know if you guys can see these words up here very good. Okay. Well, he had a weakness for Philistine women. We'd established that, right? Every relationship that's really mentioned in the Bible is with another Philistine woman. So he had a weakness for this particular ethnicity, I guess, if you want to use it. He also had a history of jumping into relationships really, really quickly. Not really thinking about it. He sees someone, he likes them, he jumps in. He has a history of illicit sexual relationships. He's kind of drawn by lust. And he's basing these relationships on superficial things, okay? He sees the woman, he thinks she's beautiful, he decides he's got to have her. He gets married to her and gets into a relationship with her, but he has a history of purely being motivated by superficial things. He doesn't get to know these women. There's no deep connection with these women. There's no spiritual bond here. There's no mutual interest. It's just, wow, she's really hot. I'm going to marry her. Wow, she's really hot. She's the one I want now. So he's a pretty easy target, don't you think? And I'm sure the Philistine leaders would have seen this. So they chose Delilah as a pretty good weapon. So now let's look a little bit at Delilah and kind of who she is. Here's what I like to call her. She's kind of what I would refer to as an army of one, okay? The Philistines think that she's on their side. Samson meets her, thinks that she's on his side, but Delilah's really only on Delilah's side. See, what happens is the Philistines offer her 1,100 pieces of silver to trap Samson. Find out what the secret is to his strength. Once you find this secret out, tell us so we can capture him, and we're going to give you 1,100 pieces of silver. Now, it's important to understand that in today's monetary standards, this would be the equivalent of $750,000. So they're offering this woman almost $1 million to kind of play this guy, get the secret of his power, and then basically hand him over. So Samson loves Delilah, or I hesitate to say he actually loves her. Samson thinks he loves Delilah. But what does Delilah love? She loves money. That's what she's after. So the relationship starts, and her job is to get to the key of Samson's power. And so she starts asking him, what's the secret to your power? Why are you so strong? Where does it come from? And Samson starts by telling her a series of lies. And you can find this in Judges 16. So in Judges 16:7, he tells her, bind me with 7 green cords. If you do this, I won't be able to break free, okay? So she does this. He goes to sleep. She binds him with these 7 green cords. And then she lets the Philistines in and tells Samson that they're there. And Samson breaks free. And she whines. And, the Philistines are, kind of thwarted. And so she whines and she's like, oh, come on. And she asks him again, tell me what's the key to your strength. Tell me what it is. So in the next verse, Judges 16:11 through 13, he says, bind me fast with new ropes, okay? So he gives her another way that, but he's kind of playing with her, kind of stringing her along. So she does this. He goes to sleep. She ties him with these new ropes. The Philistines come in. She tells him they're here. He breaks free, and they lose again. And again, she whines. Oh, come on. Tell me the key to your strength. Really, I want to know. Now, let me ask you this, though. Wouldn't you start to be getting just a little bit suspicious at this point? I mean, twice she asks him, twice he gives her an answer, twice she does exactly what he told her, and twice the Philistines show up. So I'm thinking, I don't know. Samson maybe not playing with a full deck. I'm not really sure. But I think I would have caught on by now, but whatever. He doesn't. So in Judges 16:13 through 14, he tells her, weave 7 braids of my hair into the fabric of the loom and tie it with a pin. Now, he's getting a little closer to the truth this time. Has something to do with the hair, right? He's getting a little bit closer, still not telling her the truth. So, what do you think happens this time? He breaks out. She does what he says. The Philistines come in. He breaks free. And, then there it is again. So this is the 3rd time he's told her a lie, and the 3rd time that she's turned on him. Now, certainly I would think the 3rd time's a charm, but no. Because here's what happens. Delilah plays what I like to call the trump card. How can you say you love me and not confide in me? That's what she says in Judges 16:15. How can you say you love me and not confide in me? And that's really what this message is based on tonight. If you loved me, then you would. It's called emotional manipulation, people. That's what it's called. And people do it all the time. Sometimes we know we're doing it. Sometimes we may not even be aware of it. People do it for a number of reasons, too. To build our own self-esteem, for proof of how much someone cares about them in a relationship. Sometimes it's a power trip. But in most relationships today, this is what I like to refer to as the trump card. How many times have we heard it? If you loved me, you'd do this. If you really cared for me, you'd do this. Even in non-dating relationships, if you cared for me, you'd do this. If you were really my friend, you would do this. Delilah does this because, well, she knows it's going to work. So what we're going to do right now is we are going to get in our teams, and we've got some questions. So people, let's talk about emotional manipulation in team time. Okay, so in your groups, you spent a little bit of time talking about this concept of emotional manipulation, ways that people play on the emotions of other people, why some people are easy prey, some ways you can protect yourself against emotional manipulation and things like that. I'm just going to kind of recap just a little bit. I'm mostly curious, what are some ways that you guys came up with that you can protect yourself against this kind of emotional manipulation? Were there any things you thought about? Alec, is that you out there? Yes.
I feel like one thing is that you need to recognize what's happening. Because a lot of times we just either don't care or just don't realize what's happening.
Yeah, a lot of times I think you're right. I think it has to do with an awareness. You don't realize it's happening. It's kind of subtle. Perhaps it increases over time. So it's something I've seen in a lot of relationships. Emotional manipulation, it's something that starts out small, and then people sort of, it sounds sad to say, but you almost get used to it. You almost come to expect it. And before you know it, it's a big part of your relationship, and your relationship is defined by it. What are some other things you can do to kind of protect yourself against this kind of emotional manipulation in a relationship? And again, we're not only talking about a dating relationship. What else did you guys talk about? Anything else? How about setting some boundaries? Did you talk about that? If you go into relationships, whether they're friendship type relationships or romantic type relationships, and you set some boundaries ahead of time, and you know what types of things you are and aren't willing to put up with, the things that you think are and are not acceptable, that's really helpful. So setting boundaries, I think, is probably a really good preemptive thing that you can do before you get into a relationship. What kinds of things am I going to allow? What things am I not going to allow? And when those things happen, how am I going to confront those things and have conversations? And a lot of it has to do with open communication. Because again, sometimes I think we do it without even realizing that we're doing it. Okay, but let's get back to our story, which really has to do at this point with misplaced trust. Finally, in Judges 16:17, Samson does actually tell Delilah the truth. He's lied to her 3 times. 3 times she sort of proved to him that she doesn't necessarily deserve his trust, because 3 times now she's betrayed him. But even after those 3 times, Samson seems so blinded by this lust and this desire that he has that he misplaces his trust yet another time. And he tells her the truth of his strength. He says here, "No razor has ever been used on my head, because I've been a Nazarite set apart by God since birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me." So he kind of now tells her the truth. And this trust is misplaced, which he should have known. At this point in the story, Samson really should have known that this was not a wise place to put his trust. But he does anyways. And guess what happens? Absolutely. He falls asleep. She shaves his head. And really, after all the other conversations, he falls for it yet again. The Philistines come in, and this time his strength does leave him, because he's lost his hair, right? But if we read a little bit closer in Judges 16:20, the real problem is that we're told that the Lord left him. Samson, wakes up, he realizes his hair is gone, he stands up and he's looking for his strength, and it says right in those verses, he realizes that the Lord has left him. Now, do you think the Lord has left him because he cut his hair? No. It really goes a lot deeper than that. Here's the real reason. The Lord left Samson for a couple of reasons. Samson loved Delilah more than he loved God. You see, when Samson allowed his hair to be cut, which was a symbol, again, if we think about what I talked about in the beginning, this symbol that he had been set apart from God from birth was his hair. When he allowed that hair to be cut, what he really said is that he loved Delilah more than he loved God, and that he loved his life of sin more than he loved his life as a servant of God. So that's really why the Lord left him. It didn't have anything to do with his hair. His hair was just a symbol. The Lord left him because, basically, did the Lord leave him or did he leave the Lord? I mean, I think it might have been the other way around. Through his actions, he really kind of left the Lord. And so what do we expect when we turn our backs on God? So that's it. He finally gets caught. In the end of the story, Samson gets caught. He's taken prisoner. He ends up in the heart of the Philistines' camp. And actually, we do, if we follow the story through to its completion, we actually see God working in Samson in spite of that betrayal. Because actually what happens is Samson gets this last bit of strength as his hair starts to grow back, and he kind of laments and repents and repairs his relationship with God. And he actually, if you remember the end of the story, he knocks down the pillars and brings down the house on all the Philistines and himself. So from within inside the enemy walls, he actually ends up winning anyways. So that's a story for another time about how God can use us in spite of our mess ups and in spite of our mistakes. But the negative relationship in this story really gives us a lesson on how sin works in our lives. Sin tends to be a relentless thing. A lot of times, I'm sure many of you can attest to the fact that you struggle with the same issue, the same sin issue, the same stepping stone, the same stumbling block over and over again. When sin enters our lives in whatever fashion it might enter, and it tends to be relentless, it tends to keep rearing its head. It's that one thing that we struggle with most. And it drives a wedge between us and God. That's really what happened here with Samson by the end of this story. His actions drive a wedge between him and God, and there's a separation that he has to repair. But at the end of the story, what I want you to really take away from this message is this concept of this emotional manipulation, this idea of, if you love me, you will. When you're in a relationship and those are the kinds of things you start to hear, that's the time that you need to start questioning what the motivations of the other person is. Because in a true relationship that's really about love and mutual respect, those kinds of questions really shouldn't be asked. If you love me, you would do this. If you cared for me, you would do that. If you loved me, you would prove it. In a real loving relationship that's based on unconditional love, and again, in that relationship that you have with God, you're not asked to prove your love over and over again by jumping through hoops and acting in certain ways. So my best advice tonight is to put as much distance between you and yourself and the sources of temptation in your life. If your relationship isn't God-honoring, maybe it's time to rethink it. If a person you're in a relationship with is manipulating you and playing with your emotions, maybe it's time to think about whether or not that's the kind of relationship you should be in. But again, this doesn't just go back to romantic relationships. I know that the series is called Love Story, but I'm asking you to evaluate all of the relationships in your life. What's really going on there? How are you treating other people, and how are you allowing yourselves to be treated in these relationships that you're in? I'm going to ask the band to come on back up on stage, and I'm going to close us in prayer. Lord, I just want to thank you for all of the people that you bring into our lives, our friends, our family, those romantic relationships that can be so important, Lord. They're not a bad thing. But we want to make sure, Lord, that we're always honoring you with our relationships, and that our interactions with people are God-honoring, and that our motivations are pure. So in all of our relationships, Lord, I ask that we keep our hearts and minds set on you, that our self-worth is firmly rooted in you, and that is where we find our self-worth, not in having to prove ourselves constantly to other people, to prove that we love them and to prove that we deserve their love in return. Lord, I thank you for the students here tonight, and I ask that as they go about their weeks in school, they think about their relationships and always remember that you are at the center of each and every positive relationship in our lives. Amen.